Good morning, everyone. So today's lesson is going to be on hand tools. I have a wide range set up in front of me, and we're just going to go through sort of each one and sort of explain its purpose and the multiple uses that they have. So we're going to start with hammers, and there are a wide range. These are just some of the more common that you'll see. First one that we're going to talk about is known as the claw hammer. Now, it's called the claw due to the top end back here having a substantial curve to the sort of hook back end, as you can see there. One of the reasons why this has this specific layout or design is that this curve allows you to get more leverage whenever you are trying to pull out nails, screws, or anything else. How you would do that is you would have a screw or a nail embedded into a board or anything like that, and you would simply use the back end to grip the screw, and then you would basically just sort of pull back away from the screw in order to pull that screw or nail out. Now, depending on, again, sort of which hammer you have or what type of hammer you have, the overall weight is going to vary. The reason for this is just the heavier the weight is, sort of the more force you can get behind either striking a nail or a screw in itself. The proper way to hold them is by the lower end of the hand grip here. And then whenever you are striking, you basically want to use your forearm and your wrist mainly to then lean back and then pull forward as your hand or arm goes down to then use the face of the hammer to strike any of those nails. The other version of the typical hammer that you'll see is known as the framing hammer. Now you'll notice the difference in the back end or the claw end here, and it's a lot flatter. One of the reasons for this is it's mainly used for sort of prying boards apart. You can simply insert the claw in between a groove of something and then basically use that sort of same leverage on the back end here to pry up multiple bars. Typically, what will happen in framing hammers here is the face of the hammer itself will typically have a waffle type pattern. This is simply just to help sort of ensure a lot of grip whenever you are striking any of the nails or anything, but not always. In particular, this one is flat. Similar to the other hammer, you always want to grip it on the lower end, and again, sort of using your wrist and arm to pivot and swing down and use as much force as possible to strike the nail. One that isn't as commonly used in theater is known as the ball-peen hammer. It's similar to the other hammers, except it does not have any sort of claw to pry or pull any nails or screws out of boards. The ball-peen has a rounded bulb here on the back end, and it is mainly used in sort of shaping or manipulating metal or thin sheets of material to sort of bend it in such a way or curve it to ensure that everything sort of comes out in the shape that you want. It does still have sort of a flat hammer surface on the front end, and again, it can be used for striking or mainly sort of de-beveling or sort of flattening out any kind of sharp edges on sort of sheet metal goods. Another hammer type that we have, which can mainly be used in scenic painting for sort of just closing up any paint lids, is known as the rubber mallet. It is similar to, again, all of the other hammers in the fact that it has a long grip, and then it has two face surfaces for striking. It's known as a rubber mallet because the top end here is typically made of rubber, and this is mainly to prevent any kind of marring or scuffs that you would typically get with some of the other hammers. You can typically use this as sort of a forceful guide if there are any kind of set pieces or things that need to be adjusted slightly, but they may be a little too cumbersome. You can usually use either end to gently persuade those pieces of material to get into the position that you want overall. Another tool that you can use as sort of a persuasion device is known One of the other tools that you can use as sort of a persuasion device is known as the dead blow hammer. It is similar to the mallet, or the rubber mallet, in the fact that it has sort of the same shape, but it has sort of a different use. The dead blow, the overall head of the hammer is usually filled, as you can hear, with sort of buckshot or some kind of lead material, and it has a little bit of space for those little pellets to move. The reason for this is whenever you actually strike an object, the force of the swing is actually going to shift all of those pellets or lead pieces, and actually whenever you strike it, they'll forcibly give you a lot more impact upon hitting a device or material or anything else. This is generally used to sort of move things a little bit more substantially. It's great for sort of adjusting a fit of certain pieces, say for materials that need to intertwine quite perfectly. You can generally use this to ensure that it actually sort of goes and fits quite nicely. There is another tool known as the sledgehammer. It has sort of the same shape as the dead blow and the rubber mallet, except it usually has a steel or metal hammer head, and that is mainly used for destruction purposes, simply because the force that you can get behind it will usually punch through or break apart most wood materials quite easily. Next, we're going to talk about some hand saws that we have available, and again, these are just some of the more basic types that you're going to see around most scene shops or carpentry shops. There are a lot more, and some of them are sort of more specific or detail prone. Well, the first one is known as the back miter saw. Its general shape is pretty square, having the teeth along the bottom edge here, and the handle on the back is usually raised up in such a way that if you have a piece of material that you're trying to cut in such a way, your hand and the overall blade is usually positioned a little further away to give you a lot more control over your cut. It has a pretty flat edge, as you can see here, and you'll generally have a secondary tool or guide pieces to sort of help ensure that you cut everything in the sort of shape that you want. It's known as basically the miter saw or miter hand saw, for the fact that if you have one of those sort of specialty sort of guides or holders, it'll generally have sort of 45 or various other angles already sort of predetermined in that guide or hold, and you can generally just sort of slot the saw into it and then make your cuts along the material. You generally want to have or ensure that the teeth of the saw are in full contact with the material at all times, because if you sort of rock it one way or the other, you're not going to get a clean cut. Another hand saw that we have has sort of two versions. They are known as either the rip saw or the cross cut saw. As you'll notice here, you can sort of see the difference in sort of the blade patterns. And depending on what you were doing, the rip saw or the cross cut saw is what you want. The rip saw is basically indicating that you are physically sort of ripping in line with the grain of the wood, and that just provides a cleaner cut as you're going through. The cross-cut saw will generally have sort of a variety of teeth and orientation, and that basically just sort of ensures that you are sort of, whenever you are cutting across the material, that you get a very clean cut. Kind of one of the more specialty saws in existence, but we do have one available, so I can demonstrate it, is known as the keyhole saw. It basically goes down to a thin taper and then gradually increases in overall size. This particular saw is great for sort of burrowing out holes. It is known sort of as the keyhole saws because it was a great and easy way to sort of cut keyholes in doorways. You would basically have a hole bored out and you could insert the thin tapered edge and slowly move the saw back and forth to then widen the hole out to create a keyhole itself. Another specialty saw that is available is known as the flush trim saw. It is a very thin blade, and what these particular tools or saws allow you to do is cut away excess material while sort of maintaining a lot more control over the saws themselves. The general shape allows you to sort of easily pull or push the saw forward or backwards. And in the picture above, you can kind of see what it is supposed to do to ensure that everything sort of remains flush. It is called the flush trim because it'll cut away all of that excess material to then sort of smooth out the overall surface of the project. Mainly used in cutting away dowel rods, if you have such use for them, as it'll cut away them pretty quickly. Not necessarily a saw per se, but it is sort of a great tool to sort of help manipulate some of the wood or material that you're working with. It is sort of your general axe. Again, they can come in sort of wide variety of ranges and sizes, and sometimes, depending on the brand or type, it can sort of be used as a hammer on the backside to sort of strike any object that you so wish. It is great for sort of distressing set pieces. If something is supposed to look a little more rugged or decayed, you can generally use the axe to sort of chip away some of the wood or other material to sort of help show signs of ages in the project. Moving on to layout tools. This is sort of a just broad term to describe a lot of tools that sort of help sort of shape and help control whatever project you are working on. A lot of these are used in conjunction with pencils and some other tools to help sort of mark out exactly what kind of measurements you so need. One of the first ones and sort of the most commonly used is known as a speed square. One of the reasons why it's called a speed square is simply because it has this perfect sort of 90-degree angle even though it is in the shape of a triangle. One of the great things about this particular tool is it has a little bit of an edge on the bottom, and what that typically will allow you to do is if you take your material once again, you can sort of rest the speed square along it and then slide it, and then wherever your mark needs to be, you can simply hold on to the speed square and then scribe your line. One of the other things that you can typically do with the speed square is sort of mark angles or varying other degrees. Now, at the beginning, or just as it has a natural 45-degree angle on the long side or the hypotenuse. So if at any time you need to create or mark a 45-degree angle, you can take a speed square and then just scribe that line to know exactly where you need to cut. You can get other degrees simply by taking the pivot end. You may not be able to see it quite clearly in this picture, but there's usually a small arrow in this corner or the square corner. And what you would do then is rotate your piece, and on the top edge you'll line up those marks or angle or degrees with the top edge of the board. So whenever you pivot up, whatever degree or angle that you're trying to go for, you'll just stop at that particular angle, and then once again, whenever you are set, you would then just scribe that line all together. Another really good handy tool is known as the framing square. It is typically usually about 2 feet by about 1.5 feet. Some can be smaller, some can be larger, but this is a great tool, again, sort of similar to the speed square, where it'll typically have a completely square or 90-degree corner on one edge, and this allows you to sort of line up your edge with the edge of the board or material that you are using, and then again scribe your line wherever you need. The fact that it has sort of a 2-foot length allows you to get further down the material, because some of the sheets of material that we work with can be up to 4 foot wide by 8 feet long. So this is a great tool to sort of help you figure out where all of your measurements need to be. Similarly, it can be used as just a standard straight edge, which allows you to sort of make 2 marks on your material, and then you can simply just sort of line up your 2 points and then scribe that straight edge or straight line with whatever you need. If you can sense a pattern, the next one is obviously substantially larger. It is known as a drywall square. Again, similar to the speed square, it has this edge here, which is a little behind, or it has a little bit of depth to allow you to sort of use this shorter edge here to line up on the edge of your material to then allow you to scribe whatever line you need. The overall length of these can typically be about 48 inches, which is the standard size for the width of most material or sheet goods that we would use in the scene shop, such as plywood, Luan, foam, or any other large sheet goods that we can come across. This again can be used as sort of a standard straight edge, where if you just sort of have 2 points, you can use the longer length here to line up those 2 points and then scribe that overall long length. One of the other layout tools that we sort of utilize quite a bit in theater, which sort of help, again, sort of create lines over a long length, or try to customize a specific angle or degree, can be, first of all, known as the chalk line. It is basically a small little device which usually has a little hook up here and then a little reel system here. Now, similar to the ribbon tape, such as like the 300-foot length, this has a whole lot of string coiled up on the inside here, which allows you to sort of pull this tab out to whatever length that you so need. And it's known as a chalk line for the fact that they are usually filled with chalk to allow you to actually sort of scribe a length that you need. So you can either use this in conjunction with a friend or by yourself. The front end or the clip usually has a small little hole which you can use to sort of hook to either an edge of material or if you have access to it, you can put a screw down to then stretch out that string. Now, to properly use a chalk line, what you would typically do is hook it off to your material, stretch the full length that you need, and then whenever you are or getting ready to, you want to make sure that you are sort of lifting that chalk line up so it doesn't sort of scrape or rub against the ground, because then a lot of that chalk will rub off and then sort of discombobulate you in terms of what line you want. So as you sort of stretch the string itself, you'll then get to wherever position you want to be in, and then you would basically pull the string right at the end of the full device and then stretch it as much as you can to ensure that it is extremely taut. Once you are taut, you would then just sort of pick up some part of the inner string and then sort of pluck it like a guitar string or any other string type. And what that'll do is the impact of whenever it strikes back down onto the material, it will then transfer the chalk from the string to the project. Now, when it comes to chalk lines, there are a wide range of colors or types of colors or pigments that you can put in these tools. It is never advised to sort of mix colors together because obviously some pigments are better to use than others. The most typical type is blue, as it is a pretty easy color to distinguish from most material, and it does sort of dissipate or disappear over time substantially better than others. The worst color to use is a red pigment. This is mainly due to the fact that the red pigment kind of stains or embeds itself in the material and generally does not want to disappear even with several layers of paint or any kind of other sort of washing techniques. There are some other colors such as lavender, black, green, so it really just depends on sort of whatever color chalk you have, but it also depends on what you're trying to do. Lavender is a lot easier to sort of get rid of, whereas blue is just the most commonly used. Another tool that we have, which is called a bevel gauge, initially looks just like this right here. And what this does, or allows you to do, is sort of mark and replicate multiple angles, such as sort of a corner of a house. If you don't know exactly what the measurement or the degree of that angle is, you can use this tool right here. Now, it'll typically have sort of a locking device or a sort of nut and screw right in the middle, and you would basically loosen that up, and then that would allow you to sort of take the blade or the tongue, lock it back together or close to, and then you can then alter the overall angle or change that you have there. And once you have it locked in, or you have the degree or corner marked, you would simply just really tighten down that nut or screw, and then you can typically use this to then replicate that particular angle or cut by simply just taking this, again, sort of to your material, placing it on the edge there, which would then allow you to scribe that exterior, which is the outside, or the interior angle, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Another tool quite similar to the speed square or the framing square, but just in a smaller compact form, is known as the tri-square. The difference in this particular square is that the base is usually a little wider and the blade or the tongue is usually centered in that particular piece. So quite similar to the others, you would take your material, take your tri-square, and then sort of just allow you to sort of glide the square over the material to sort of accurately mark wherever your lines need to be. These are great when working with sort of a lot of hand tools in particular, as this is fairly accurate. There is some substantial heft or weight to the base itself, which allows it to sort of stay in place a lot easier than other pieces. Next, we're going to talk about pry bars. Pry bars are either used in destructive means or sort of a little bit of manipulation of the materials you are working on. Quite similar to the hammer section, where sort of the claw ends of the hammers are used to sort of help either provide a lot of leverage to pull nails or screws out of a project. These pry bars do quite the same thing. They'll typically be used to separate two boards that are sandwiched together. You would then just sort of take it and put it right in the middle of a seam of material to then sort of push those two pieces apart. Again, there are a wide range and types of pry bars, but these are sort of the more common and the ones that we have available here. You've ever sort of seen a lot of crime TV shows. A lot of people will say someone's probably been hit in the head with a crowbar. That is basically this right here. They are fairly substantially heavy, and they have, again, sort of a V-shaped prong on one end, and then a sort of flatter V-end prong shape on the other. So depending on, again, what you need, you would typically use this end here to provide you a lot more leverage whenever you are trying to pull something up out of the ground or between another project. Or if you need to sort of sandwich in between two pieces of material, you would use the flatter ends to get in between and then sort of just wedge or pry the two apart. This is usually sort of the more destructive piece. You wouldn't want this whenever you were trying to sort of finesse something to get it apart. A lovely baby form of another pry bar is known as the cat's paw. It basically just gets that name because of the sort of small, flat, beveled end, similar to the crowbar. This end is great for sort of getting in between two pieces of material to then sort of force the two apart. The other end has another V-shaped groove in which you can sort of use to get in or underneath nails or screws, but it has a little bit of a flatter edge which allows you to sort of get a little bit of length or distance between you and that screw or nail to then sort of help rip or pry that one apart. Or a typical or common one that you'll see in most scene shops is known as basically just the flat bar. It has, again, sort of that curved shape here, in which it provides you a lot of leverage whenever you are trying to pull something up from the ground, so you don't have to bend down as much. Or it has another tapered, beveled edge, which is a little wider on the other end, to sort of either get underneath, again, something, or help sort of just push two pieces apart. Any one of these can be used to sort of help move things apart. If you can get sort of that flat end underneath a project, you can sort of get a little bit of leverage to get it off the ground, and then you could use some of the other devices such as the rubber mallet or some other hammer type to sort of help move something apart so you don't sort of mar up the floor as much. As I mentioned before, there are sort of a variety of types. This is sort of a combination of the cat's paw and the pry bar. And then even a small, adorable version of a staple puller. It sort of uses that same concept as some of the other pry bars, in which sort of the head or the flat bar here allows you to sort of dig underneath staples, and then uses the leverage behind it to sort of help pry or pull up those staples. Moving on to wrenches. Once again, there are sort of a wide variety of different types of wrenches in existence. We do have quite a few of these variations available, and each one sort of has its pros and cons for use and what you're trying to do. The first one is simply known as sort of the adjustable wrench, also known as sort of a C-wrench or crescent wrench. This particular device just allows you to sort of adjust the overall width between the two tongues by a small little swivel or screw, depending on the type or brand, and it either raises or lowers that bottom tongue to decrease or increase the overall width to make sure that you are secured around whatever nut or bolt you are working on. These are great for projects that have a lot of open space in them. They are kind of the go-to tool for lighting design or lighting technicians, simply because there is a lot of adjustment that needs to go on with sort of the clamps that are involved or other parts and pieces which use or utilize a lot of bolts and nuts to adjust the overall lamp itself or anything else in that piece. Now, like I said, they sort of range in variety and types. The most common that you'll see is that first one that has that little screw which you can adjust. But with technology, of course, there are a vast variety. This particular one has a small little trigger on the bottom of the tool, and you would simply squeeze that trigger, and that would adjust that bottom tongue once again to decrease the overall grip on a particular nut or bolt. And then simply to release, there is usually a button which you would push, and it would reset the overall wrench. Now, another type that we can come across, which is fantastic for a lot of projects depending on what you're doing, is known as the speed wrench. And the speed wrench is basically an enclosed circle here, but the fun thing about this one is on the inside of this outside edge is a little ratcheting mechanism which allows you to sort of constantly adjust the overall wrench without having to physically reset the position of the wrench, such as you would have to do with the adjustable. They come in a wide range of sizes, all the way from 1/4 inch, sometimes all the way up to 1 inch or greater, depending on the sort of size that you need. Another one that we do not have on us, but is a great overall tool, is known as a pipe wrench. It is simply known as that. It is mainly used by plumbers, and what it does is it grips pipes of varying sizes, once again, by adjusting a small screw on the back end. I'll post a picture right here. And what that does is the overall grooves of the actual wrench itself will tighten as you sort of wrench or manipulate your hand or the pipe itself. And it's a great way of securing or knowing that you're not going to sort of slip off of whatever pipe you are trying to work with. Some of the other types of wrenches are, again, sort of quite similar to what we've seen already, but they sort of pose a little bit of a different purpose. The first is sort of known as the box ends. It is quite similar to the ratcheting version, except the enclosed section does not have the ability to sort of rotate around, allowing you to sort of tighten or loosen a bolt a lot easier. So whenever you are using one of these, the fact that you can sort of fully encase the nut or bolt allows you to remain on that bolt and give you a lot more sort of force without sort of slipping off, which allows you to sort of tighten it a little bit easier. The other is known as the open box ends, and that is basically just sort of creating a C-wrench style in which you would just sort of slot that over a nut or a bolt. But then again, the fact that it does have that open end would mean that every time you are adjusting it, there is a chance that you could slip off of that particular nut or bolt. But it also means that you can sort of easily pop it off, adjust yourself, reattach, and finish off the tightening or loosening of that nut or bolt. Similar to, again, sort of that ratcheting box end version, we have the socket wrench. And basically what this is this is just sort of the standard form, and it has at the end a little sort of pop-up which allows you to sort of attach or change out the various types or size of the wrench that you have. So quite similar to that ratcheting version, it allows you to sort of rotate while sort of maintaining a singular position on that nut or bolt. Typically on the back end, they will have sort of a little tab, and this little tab, depending on the position, will either mean that you are in forward or reverse, which means, as it is, that if you are in forward, you will be driving or tightening, and if you are in reverse or backwards, it'll basically loosen or remove said nut or bolt. Moving on to other sort of hand tools that can either tighten or loosen things depending on what you're doing, are sort of your basic screwdrivers. Now, in general, whenever you say screwdriver, you may mean something specific, but obviously there are a lot of variations of these screwdrivers themselves. One particular version, noted here, are known as nut drivers. They are quite similar in the fact that they work the same as sort of the wrenches that we just discussed, but they are typically elongated versions to allow you to sort of accurately drop in above in sort of fairly tight spaces in which a normal wrench would not be able to get or reach. Depending on sort of the type or the version, the end will be a little bit wider, and that usually it signifies the overall size of that particular nut driver. But at the same time, some may actually sort of have in sort of the neck of the nut driver may be hollow. And what this would allow any of those to do is, as you're tightening or loosening any kind of bolt which has sort of a long thread section, that the threads can nicely sort of go through the neck of the nut driver, which means that you don't have to sort of adjust or cut down that nut or the threads itself. The more common type that we typically see or use are known one as the slotted or flat screwdriver. Similar to sort of the pry bars, it usually has a very a single wide flat edge, and again can sort of vary in overall width depending on what type of screws that you are working with. The other sort of more common or typical version that you will typically see is known as the Phillips. And this basically is a sort of cross figure which allows you to sort of slot into most of the standard styles of screw heads. We'll discuss a little bit those here in a bit. While these two are the most commonly used in construction, they are sort of phasing out in such a way because of how easy it is to sort of mar or strip the overall heads of the screws. And I'll sort of discuss what this means as we sort of go along and whenever we get to the actual diagram of sort of the rest of the versions. Now, these particular versions, or the two that I just showed you, are hand-driven, which means basically every time you want to turn that particular screwdriver, you physically have to rotate it yourself, which means either a lot of adjusting or moving your hand wherever needed. Similar to sort of the ratchet or socket set, they do sort of come in fancier versions, which again sort of can have sort of a little slide here, and depending on sort of what position, they're usually three. One all the way forward, usually to drive the screw. There is then sort of a middle version, which basically means that it won't spin at all. And then all the way back or towards the handle itself is usually for reversing or pulling out any of those screws. The great thing about these particular versions is the fact that you can typically remove the overall screw or the drive itself and replace it with another type. That's great for the fact that you no longer then have to sort of have multiple types of screwdrivers, which can take up a lot of space and can quite easily sort of disappear. So while screwdrivers are great in their own aspect, the version or the type of sort of nuts and bolts that have sort of taken over or become more widely available are known as Allen keys. Now, the best way to describe these is if you ever bought something from IKEA or bought some type of furniture that had to be physically assembled yourself, you were probably given one of these types of Allen keys in that sort of construction set. There are two different types, and they are the SAE or the metric version. The SAE is sort of the American version, which is the Society of Automotive Engineers. And these typical range or sizes, depending on sort of the Allen key, can go all the way from a 1/16 and then most typically up to about 3/8, sometimes even 1/2 inch, depending on what you're doing. If you have not ever seen one of these types, it is basically a small little L-shaped piece of metal, and it has a hexagon shape on the end here, and generally on the other side as well. Sometimes they'll have sort of a ball socket version on that. So depending on what it is, you may get one or you may get the other. Now, obviously the difference between SAE and metric is slight, and that just the overall sizes sort of vary in overall size, and the reason for it is beyond me. Really should just sort of go to the metric system, as it is widely used in just about all other regions of the world. Now, there is one other type of Allen key, and this particular version is known as the torque system. Similar to sort of the hexagon shape, but a little bit different. The head will typically have sort of a star pattern in its overall design. Now, the reason why torque is sort of the best or should be used the most is the fact that that sort of star shaped allows the tool to gently and nicely sort of fit into that screw head and gives you the best sort of force and torque to then remove or tighten up any of the bolts that you are working with. The metric and the SAE are also sort of really great in that aspect, and the fact that the sort of hexagon shape that it has fits quite nicely into that sort of screw head and allows you to use sort of the fulcrum or the shape of the tool itself to then manipulate tightening or loosening up the bolts. The slotted was obviously the worst in the way that it sort of destroyed or removed a lot of the material of the heads themselves. And sort of that's why we then moved to the Phillips or the hex, or sorry, not hex, sort of the cross shape. But over time, either the tool itself will get worn down or the screw heads themselves will start to wear out, and you won't get that great bite that you originally had when it was first created. Thus, creating the Allen keys, which is becoming a lot more popular in design and sort of availability. So you have probably seen these sometime in your life. So here we have sort of a basic dry type and what the screw heads would typically look like. I know obviously this camera version isn't the greatest, but here's sort of a better look of sort of the top view of what each screw would look like, and then sort of a slight angled view to sort of see how that overall shape affects the screw head itself. As you can see, the Phillips and or Pearson, it basically creates the X or the cross. Then you have the slotted version, which is basically just that singular long gap. There is sometimes what is known as sort of the combination in which either type of tool can be used. You would typically want to utilize one over the other to sort of evenly wear out the overall thread of that sort of screw head. As you can sort of see, the socket hex or Allen has that unique sort of hexagon shape. We do have another type known as the square or Robertson bit. There are a lot of facilities or companies and or individuals who work in construction who would actually prefer the square bits over the Phillips. And that is simply because, again, the fact that the square head of the tool will generally fit and provide you a lot better torque and control than its counterpart. Then, as I mentioned before, the last one, the Torx, has sort of that sort of diamond shape, which allows the sort of grooves of the tool itself to seat properly and have a really good control, tight fit for torque and taking it out or putting something in. Moving on then to pliers. Once again, there's a multitude of variations, variety, and types and sizes of pliers. We're going to cover what we have available and some of the ones that we may not, but are fairly common to see. The first one that we're going to talk about is known as the Linesman pliers. It has a fairly unique shape, and what this particular tool is great for is it does have a little bit of a cutting edge on this back end here, and that's great for cutting or stripping wires. And then the front or top end here is generally used for sort of helping to grip wires, nuts, or bolts. And what that typically will do is, if it's used for wiring, you can basically put the end of the wires in between those, crimp it, and then usually twist to sort of pull everything together to make it uniform, to then insert into a socket or any other electrical device to ensure that everything fits nicely. The next version is known as the tongue and groove. It is quite similar to the crescent wrench in the fact that it has the ability to sort of change the overall opening of that grip space. Now, to adjust it, you simply open it up. This particular version has a little push button but you'll generally open it up and then be able to slide that second or lower jaw up and down this sort of track here. And that allows you to sort of increase or decrease the overall size to then adjust it to the proper width of the nut or bolt that you are currently working on. Another version of that is known as the slip joint. It is similar to the linesman's plier, where it has sort of that wide, bulky end, and then it is similar to the tongue and groove for the fact that it has a small little hole or track that it can sort of go through to then adjust only slightly the opening of the tool itself. One of the other types that we would normally see, I don't have one on me, I think I have left it at my house, is known as the needle nose pliers. Similar again to sort of the linesman pliers, generally at the base or the bottom, as you can see here. It'll have sort of a cutting section, which allows you to sort of easily cut some wiring if you need. But then sort of the top end is sort of an elongated and tapered piece, which allows you to sort of get into some devices which may be a little more difficult to achieve with some of the other variations of pliers that we have. Another type is known as end nips, and they look like this here. Now, these particular tools are great for sort of cutting away staples or pulling staples out. As whenever we go over those in the pneumatic section, you'll sort of see why they are great. But one of the ways that you would utilize these is you can note it's sort of a curved shape on the head of the tool itself. And what you would typically do is, grabbing our fancy demonstration board, is you would take your end nips, open it up as wide as need be, squeeze, grip the tool or grip the staple that you need to take out, and then basically rock the tool using that sort of curved edge to then pry off or pry out that particular staple. Now, the trick with these, and it takes a little bit of finesse and getting used to, is if you squeeze too hard on that staple or nail, you'll more often than not clip or cut that nail off as opposed to prying it out. So it takes just a little bit of pressure around the staple or nail, and then you just sort of rock back and forth to help sort of pull it out of the material you're working on. Another version that is similar to it, but is mainly used for cutting, is known as sort of diagonal cutters. They are again quite similar to the linesman's pliers base, in which it has sort of the cutting edges on the tool itself, and the bottom is usually flat to allow you to get low enough on the piece and then cut the material away. Another type that is a little more towards the electrical ends and shouldn't be needed in this class, but there may come an occasion, you never know. These are basically known as wire strippers. And the great thing about these in particular, as I get a little close up there, you can notice that there are sort of varying grooves in this particular front end or the base of the tool. And those varying sort of grooves sort of change depending on what diameter wire we're trying to sort of cut. So there are different gauges that you would then line up with that particular groove in the top here. Simply cut or squeeze together, and then you should be able to cut away the outer protective sleeve to reveal the wire below. They also will then sort of have a cutting edge, once again, sort of towards the base or the bottom of the opening. Another tool, actually, is generally used for some general purpose metal work, such as sort of sheet metal, and those are known as 10 snips. They're also great for sort of cutting chicken wire or other sort of heavier gauge wiring, and you would simply just sort of open it up. There's usually a locking system which prevents it from opening up whenever not in use, such as that right there. And again, the overall shape of the base of the head varies depending on what you're typically trying to do. This one, as you can sort of see, is fairly in line with both sides, which means you'll get a pretty accurate and straight cut whenever you're using that one. Some of the other variations allow you to sort of cut and sort of push away some of the material to one side or the other. Moving on then to clamps. Clamps are basically the essential tools to ensure that all of your pieces or project parts stay where you want them to be at all times. Once again, there are a wide variety and sizes, so depending on whatever project you are working on, one may be better than the other. One of the first type, which is again sort of the most commonly seen or used, is known as the carpenter clamp or the C-clamp, mainly due to the size and the shape, which creates a C right here. And this particular type has a threaded rod, which allows you to sort of then raise or lower depending on, again, which direction you turn it. These are great because you can get a lot of force and torque to ensure that you get a tight grip or hold onto your project. The tricky thing about these, though, is since they have sort of a metal or hard surface on both sides, if you over tighten it on particular wood projects, they can generally mar or sort of create divots or dents in your project unless you sort of use something else to sort of prevent that. One of the other versions is known as sort of the flat bar or quick grip. These are simply known as quick grips for the fact that it has sort of a trigger handle here, and what that allows you to do is as you sort of squeeze that trigger, it'll pull the overall length of the body of the clamp towards you, which allows you to then quickly grip whatever project you are working on, and then it also allows you and frees up your other hand to ensure that everything stays where you want it to. Generally, right above the handle is the release lever. So whenever you are ready to remove the clamp or you need to readjust it, you would simply put your thumb on the back end of the trigger and then squeeze that release, and then also that allows you to sort of quickly sort of adjust a lot faster than having to sit there and pull the trigger repeatedly. You can simply pull the release and then slide the tongue wherever you need it to ensure that you get a little bit of a quicker go at it. Another type which is very important, but we do not have any available, is known as a pipe clamp. Now, the pipe clamps usually come in a lot larger sizes. That quick grip right there was only about a foot long, so it's great for some of the smaller projects, such as, again, sort of the C-clamp would be used for, since it is a fairly small piece. Pipe clamps, on the other hand, can go anywhere from 2 feet up to about 8 or even 10 feet. So depending on what sort of size of a project you're working on, any of the larger pipe clamps would be what you would want to go to. Similar to the flat bar is it has sort of a slide that basically glides along the pipe itself to then sort of adjust the overall width of the project you're working on. It then has a little, again, threaded rod at the end, which allows you to sort of tighten or decrease the overall pressure that you're putting on the two pieces that you're working on. Another version of the pipe clamp that we do have, which is a little bit of a larger version of the quick grip, is again another flat bar type. This one is a little bit larger. Instead of having sort of that quick trigger pull, it has another sort of piece that slides along the overall tongue or base of the clamp itself. And then it again has sort of a threaded rod to ensure that whenever you are ready, you can then adjust it to tighten or loosen up the project. To adjust the overall piece along that sort of tongue or slide is, again, there's another little release which allows you to sort of squeeze it and then slide in any direction that you need. Some of the other specialty or smaller types of clamps which allow you to sort of grip or hold on to bolts, screws, or anything else are known as vice grips. Again, these come in a wide variety of sizes and shapes, but they are generally known as vice grip as a whole. To basically operate these, this is in its sort of open state, so whenever you are ready, you would simply just pull the bottom handle and it would adjust the overall opening to the actual size that you need. Similar to the other clamps that you have, there is a small bolt at the base or the back end, and what this does is as you adjust that, it'll either increase or decrease the overall size of that front or grip end there. So that's a great way of ensuring that you get a really good bite or hold, simply, again, sort of by demonstrating on our lovely test piece. So right now, it's the fact that it does not close means that I am too tight. So I would have to adjust the bolt at the back end. And you hear that click. That click basically tells you that you are engaged fully with the overall device. So at that point, once you're ready, you can then use the overall shape to then unscrew some kind of broken screw head or anything else depending on what you're trying to do. To release it, there is usually a small little tongue in between the trigger handles, and you would simply pull up away from the bolt towards the base of the handle, such as this right here. So you pinch and then pull, and that'll release and open up the clamp. Another version of the vice grip, which is mainly used to sort of hold certain projects or boards together, has another unique shape. It again has a threaded rod at the back end and the release tab down here. So again, whenever you are utilizing this one, this sort of allows you to sort of pinch and hold boards together. I'll show you again, demonstrate it on our lovely board. So once you are ready and you have it adjusted in such a way, you would simply put it on the board itself and then squeeze the trigger. And you'll hear that click once again. So one of the ways this is mainly utilized is, as opposed to sort of clamping one board in particular, you can typically widen the overall grip to whatever your board thickness is, and then maybe attach it to a table as well to ensure that that project or piece will not move whenever you are going to be working on it. One of the last versions that we have is again sort of one of those clamps, such as that one that I just demonstrated. But this particular version is known as a self-adjusting clamp. So instead of having to readjust something all the time to varying widths or measurements, you can simply just adjust it or squeeze the trigger, and the tool itself will automatically adjust tension in order to give you that sort of full and wide grip. This particular one is great for some larger projects that may be a little further or inside your table. Because of this opening here, it allows you to sort of get away from your material as much as possible. And once again, whenever you are ready to release it, you simply just sort of pry the two handles apart. And then last but not least, another version of clamp that is sort of great and some of the variety of ways, mainly using this particular clamp to sort of hold fabric or just sort of quickly grab something as a temporary hold, is known as a spring clamp. Again, these come in wide ranges of sizes, this sort of being on the smaller end, but simply squeezing the two triggers will open up the clasp, and then once you release it, the tension inside the spring here will automatically close and then give you a pretty solid hold on whatever material you are using or working with, but it is not as great and it does not provide a strong grip such as the carpenter's clamp or the flat bar or pipe clamp. One of the other types displayed here is known as sort of the hand screw clamp. Now, these are a little bit more old school in terms of having to use the top and bottom screw threaded rods to sort of grip or hold on to any kind of material. The thing or the reason why you would want to use one of these over some of the other clamps is the fact that it's usually made of wood, which would basically mean that whenever you are using that particular hand screw clamp, you aren't going to try to mar up the material you're working on. Now, there are some various ways to sort of prevent any kind of marring, such as having sort of rubber tips or ends on your clamps, or more often than not, if you have it available, if you use scrap pieces of wood, which would sort of increase the overall width between your clamps, that can be an easy way of ensuring that you don't accidentally mar up the finished product. Another reason why you would want to probably use scrap pieces of wood instead then would be depending on the overall length of that piece of scrap wood. If you have something that has a lot of pieces and you want to ensure that all of them are in line or flat, is using that extra piece of wood and then placing clamps in multiple spots to ensure that everything is covered and everything remains as compressed as possible. While these are the sort of last sort of main tools that we will sort of cover, I will sort of briefly cover some of the more unique tools that are available in the hand world or hand tool world. And again, I do mention that these are just some of the basic tools. There's obviously a wide range of hand tools and specialty items depending on sort of the project you're working on. Excuse me. But these are known as chisels. And wood chisels are small little devices which usually have a beveled edge and then a very flat surface at the bottom. These particular tools are great for sort of carving or manipulating wood in such a way that allows you to sort of take out or remove sections of the wood or sort of flatten everything out as needed. I'll probably post a couple videos which sort of utilize or showcase a lot of the uses for wood chisels themselves. Now, wood chisels do come in sort of a wide range of size and thickness and widths. So depending on sort of what you're doing, if you're only removing a little bit of material, the 1/4 inch version would be best versus this right here, which is the 1/2 inch version. So depending on, again, what you're doing, chisels are an amazing tool sort of work with. Now, as I mentioned before, we are going to cover a few sort of the specialty tools that aren't sort of widely used in theater but have sort of a unique place. One of them is basically called a rasp, and basically what this is, our particular version is broken, but it'll be pretty easy to sort of showcase what it's supposed to do. So it has a pretty unique handle shape, which allows you to have a pretty good grip on the tool itself. But really the important part is the metal grate, sort of like a cheese grater that attaches to the bottom edge there. This particular version or tool is great for sort of marring up or sort of removing some sort of sharp edges in some of the lumber, or if you're working with foam, it is a great tool to sort of help remove a good substantial bit or take out certain sections of the foam itself. Some of the other tools, which again have some multiple uses, are known as files. And obviously if you've ever used a file for fingernails, it is sort of the same concept except sort of a much larger version. And again, depending on sort of what you're typically trying to do, they come in a wide range of shapes and sizes. It'll typically have a fairly flat edge, and then usually have a sort of beveled or curved edge on the other side. So depending on what you're doing, again, either its main use and work with metal, you would want to use sort of the flat edge here to sort of get rid of some marbs or some burrs, as they're called, to ensure that you don't accidentally hurt or cut yourself on those metal pieces. Some of the curved edges, again, sort of depends on what you're working on, but they're great for sort of pipes. A lot of times you have to sort of cut pipes in half or into smaller chunks, but it's not easy to get that flat edge, obviously, on the inside of that curved pipe. So you would utilize that curved edge there. One of the other things, as I mentioned before, similar to the rasp, is its other uses. These are also great for, again, sort of carving or manipulating foam in such a way to sort of flatten out or smooth out some rough or torn up edges, or utilizing that curved edge to then sort of create streams or valleys, as it were, in the foam, just to help create the overall shape you're working on. Another version of a file is, again, sort of just a rounded version here. And again, just for smaller types of material or pipes or anything, it just allows you to sort of get inside something a little easier. So another tool that is sort of widely used in a lot of carpentry shops or facilities is known as a plane. Now, these particular planes, or this version, is one of the more sort of standard or smaller sizes. There is even a smaller version known as the block plane, and that is used for sort of rough, quick cuts or manipulation of material. Now, this particular one has, as you can sort of see there, that sort of gap. That is where the blade is housed. May not be able to see it too well, but the blade basically sticks out of that opening there, which allows you to sort of use the rest of that bottom flat surface to sort of help smooth everything out. Generally, the blades are adjustable, so depending on if you want to take more material out, or if you want to basically try to, again, smooth something out, you would reduce how much that blade is sticking out to ensure that everything sort of stays in that plane there. So while that is generally what we have available in our particular scene shop, as I mentioned before, there are, again, sort of a wide range of tools, which do include some knives, such as mat knives, or other pieces of specialty tools. But this is a general cover of what you'll typically see. Next class, we will cover power tools. So we may, or I will try to adjust sort of the volume setting to where it doesn't deafen you if we ever turn on those power tools themselves. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to either start a discussion page in the course section. Otherwise, I will see you next class.